Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final panel session today. I'm still Jill Rutter, and I'm going to be introducing my excellent panel. On my far left is Dr. Nathaniel Copsey. Nat works in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, as it's now known. He's head of Europe Strategy and Expertise Department. And Nat is obviously a civil servant, but is today representing the government. So you will find out absolutely nothing about Nat's personal views, but he is channeling his inner Liz Truss. So just treat Nat like that. But obviously there may be some questions that are off limits that you might have a go at if he really, really were a minister. So I will protect him from that. Then immediately to my left, and speaking very much for himself as well as for the Labour Party, and will get no protection whatsoever, is Stephen Kinnock MP. Stephen is Shadow Minister for Immigration and also a member of the European Scrutiny Committee in Parliament. We might talk to him a bit about that. On my immediate right, delighted to have Sophia Gaston. Sophia is Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. And on my far right is some complete non-entity we don't know, and I'm not going to bother to introduce to you, but some people think is the Director of UK and Changing Europe. So anyway, so how this session is going to work, this is very much more a session for you in the room. I've been around during the break soliciting some questions from some of you, not from all of you. Apologies for that. We do have a roving mic. Owing to the COVID meets rail strike meets Glastonbury conjunction, triple whammy, we only have one roving mic. I think we might have two. So do put your hand up. And what I'm going to do is I've got some questions I'm going to kick off with. We might run out of them, but I'm going to ask for interventions in question time format. I am now Fiona Bruce, just as Nat is Liz Truss. I think his Liz Truss is better than my Fiona Bruce. But if you want to say something, ask a question to one of the panellists about the topic we're talking about, then put your hand up and we'll try and run around and get a few of those questions and get them to bounce off the panel. So we realise we've all made you be incredibly quiet. And hello, Slido, if you want to ask something, you know, have a go. And if I can read it, then I will do that. But anyway, focus is on in the room. So I'm going to ask a question, first of all, that was put to me by Professor Margaret Macmillan, who those of you at the start will have heard of. And she asked, she actually asked this much better than I'm going to ask it, but actually, are we any clearer now about exactly what global Britain means? Ministers talk a lot about global Britain, but we've seen various things, and she came out with some excellent quote from Dominic Raab about how it was going to turn us into a whale, from a whale to a dolphin. So are we now dolphin-like navigating through the roads rather than lumpishly going like whales do and breaching once or twice and then going underwater for a long time? Sophia, do we know what global Britain means? If anyone should, it's the British Foreign Policy Group.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and I am looking forward to us getting into the weeds on global Britain, because it is something that has been sort of nebulous. It was a slogan that really was actually one of the few things that carried on with continuity from the May to the Johnsonian era, and that is because it was actually sort of really first something that came to life during the Brexit referendum itself. It is as broad a slogan as you can imagine, to allow it to be something that has been able to adapt to the changing political winds, and also something that is sort of more clearly coming into focus as the government sort of starts to really move ahead with the hard work of the strategic articulation of the project. Of course, the sort of primary strategic instrument that we've had thus far is the integrated review that was published in March last year. That document itself, I think, in many ways embedded flexibility as a kind of doctrine in and of itself, which is why I think, you know, a lot of the fundamental architecture of that has remained sort of sound and resilient even through the pretty extraordinary period that we've had over the past year. But a lot about Global Britain still very much needs to be fleshed out, and that's partly because we're moving into the implementation, which is where you have to really, in a way, take some hard choices. The integrated review very much sort of set out the frame of the choices that we were facing, and now we have to sort of actualize that by coming down at various points. One thing I would say about Global Britain is something that is happening at the moment is not just that the kind of broader geopolitical environment is very dynamic and volatile, but the reality is that the implementation of Global Britain, as the implementation of the domestic project that came out of Brexit as well, requires significant state resources and capacity in all sorts of ways that are currently being tested in new ways in real time every month as we go on. So I think the environment for the articulation and implementation of Global Britain has become more challenging since it was launched. The architecture itself is so broad that I think it is able to adapt as we go on, but we are starting to get to the pointy end. And I will just say as a final point, in terms of the British people, we've just done some polling on this, and only 12% of Brits say that they both recognise the term Global Britain and fully understand what it means. And I'm not hugely surprised by that, but certainly it should be on the government's to-do list.
Stephen, will Global Britain survive into a Labour government? Are you on board with Global Britain? Would it go May, Johnson, Starmer?
I think it was Winston Churchill who famously spoke about Britain's foreign policy after the Second World War and talked about these three, what he called majestic circles, which was the relationship with Europe, the relationship with the United States, and the relationship with the Commonwealth. And of course, our place in the world has evolved since the Second World War, and certainly the relationship with the Commonwealth, for many of absolutely the right reasons, became a very different relationship to what I'm sure Churchill was thinking of and talking about at that time. But there's no doubt at all that our foreign policy, our commercial policy, our diplomatic outlook was fundamentally defined by the transatlantic relationship and the relationship with Europe and what the coal and steel community and what came after it. Brexit has, of course, profoundly damaged that policy and that strategy, because if you have a strategy which is based on 2 or 3 very important pillars and you do deep damage to one of those pillars, your foreign policy is going to have to be completely changed and rethought. And the question then is, do you seek to repair the damage to the pillar, or do you do everything you can to continue to alienate, antagonize, insult, and patronize the people with whom you're supposed to be having good diplomatic relations, if you still believe that you need those 2 pillars? Now, if you think that you can live in a world which is based on trying to get better relationships with democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, thousands and thousands of miles away, not our backyard by any stretch of the imagination, and starting from a very low base, that's fine as a long-term ambition, but it strikes me as total delusion if you think that that's going to be the basis of your new foreign policy. So if that's what Global Britain means, then Global Britain is a delusion, because you cannot have a Global Britain policy without good, strong, constructive, productive relationships with the European Union and European governments. And tragically, since the 2016 vote, we've seen nothing but a kind of campaign of seeking to chip away and undermine at that. And you know, I think fundamentally we have to say it's been disastrous. So I think what you would see from a Labour government is an attempt, actually, ironically, to channel our inner Churchill and to say Global Britain has to rest on those majestic circles. It's time to have some grown-ups in the room who are actually going to take that policy forward. And if that's what global Britain means, then absolutely I'm on board. But global Britain without a Europe policy is simply a delusion.
So, Nat, we talk a lot in government, when we're nerding about government, about silos. You're head of Europe strategy and expertise at the FCDO, but you presumably have colleagues who are geopolitics, global people. How does the FCDO reconcile this sort of our answer Stephen's challenge that actually you can't have a sensible global Britain strategy when you have a strategy that at the moment is quite antagonistic towards the European Union? What would the Foreign Secretary say actually makes us all cohere as global Britain? Or is actually there's just a phase we're going through, we have to get over that? Both sides, as David Frost said, have to learn to live with each other in UK-EU to realise the full vision of global Britain.
Thank you, Jill. I think we are learning to live and work alongside each other collaboratively, the UK and the EU. Clearly, we have a disagreement at the moment about how best to reform the Northern Ireland Protocol to make it work. But as we've seen from the excellent cooperation between the United Kingdom and its European partners and the United Kingdom and the European Union since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the two sides are capable of working together to provide the Ukrainians with everything that they need to win, be that weapons, be that diplomatic support, and the crucial votes that we saw in the United Nations that the UK was crucial in delivering to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, be that coordinating with our European Union and European partners through the G7 and through the UN, be that through the bilateral agreements that we've recently signed with Sweden and Finland to support their application for membership of the European Union, be that with the accords that we've signed with the Poles and the Ukrainians. So bilaterally and with the European Union itself, the United Kingdom is working together very well to give the Ukrainians the support that they need, which falls clearly under the moniker of global Britain. And I would say, the first question that came up, it is clearer now what global Britain is, as we've seen from our support for the people of Hong Kong wishing to settle in the United Kingdom, through the AUKUS initiative, for example, through CHOGM, which of course is taking place, Commonwealth heads of government, the UK's leading role in that. So we are by no means the only global European power, but we are perhaps a little more global than the average. And global Britain's been quite clearly set out as a strategy, as a concept, and the tools to deliver it through the integrated review. Part of that, Jill's asked a bit about machinery of government changes, has resulted in a reconfiguration of the Whitehall architecture, a larger foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, folding into that the former Department for International Development. And the government's strategy is to bring all of our foreign policy tools under one single umbrella, so that my colleagues out in the network are speaking for all of government, so that we are working together collaboratively and effectively to deliver for the British people overseas.
So, Stephen, just to come back to you, I mean, that's actually painted quite a good picture that, notwithstanding sort of arguments about the Northern Ireland Protocol and bits of trade friction and things like that, actually, when it comes to the big issues, what Claire Fox in our earlier session might have called the sort of big issues going on, actually the UK is working quite productively, both bilaterally in Europe, but also with the European Union as a sort of institution. Do you accept that, or do you think that's...
Well, I think we can't really get away from the elephant in the room here, which is the disagreement over the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the real challenge with that is that it goes to the heart of trust and whether you can build your reputation as a country that is a country that respects the rule of law, that practices what it preaches, all of the things that you need to do in foreign policy. If you're seeking to take a wrecking ball to an international treaty that you yourself signed a very short time ago. So I think if we can get over the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol and find a resolution to that, which doesn't end in a trade war with the European Union, then it may be possible to work more effectively. For example, I'd really like to see the Lancaster House Accords, the military cooperation with France being deepened. France is the only other significant military power in Europe, and we should be seeking to really deepen that. And it's been great to see the end of the kind of naivety and complacency around the way in which many European governments have dealt with Russia, and of course our own government in particular, with London becoming awash with Russian money, with very large donations to the Conservative Party from people with very close connections to the Kremlin. You know, I'm glad that we're seeing the back of all of that, and that's the basis for better cooperation. But when you have a fundamental blockage in the relationship, which is the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's very difficult to see how you move on to better and greater strategic dialogue in that context. I mean, it's difficult to see how we get around that obstacle at the present time.
So, Anand, is the Northern Ireland Protocol row really acting as a big block? And actually, if it wasn't there, do you actually think that the UK and the EU have a view of how they'd strategically like to work together on some of these bigger issues in the future?
I mean, yes, the protocol is a massive block because it's reducing contact, it's reducing trust on both sides, it's reducing a willingness to collaborate more than they absolutely have to. In the unique circumstances of Ukraine, that's holding up quite well, but more generally, there's no conversations going on about foreign policy. So I think if that were resolved, or if that were not happening, then at least the two sides could talk about what they have in common, and they have all their vital interests in common. The one sticking point, I suppose, would be whether or not the UK needs an institutionalised foreign policy relationship with the European Union. And on that, I think the jury is slightly still out. There are some advantages to having it. The UK maybe misses out on having a sort of institutionalised forum within which to talk foreign policy with the European Union. On the other hand, the European Union doesn't really have an offer for a state the size of the UK. So, I mean, do you want to talk more generally about Global Britain, or just...
Talk about more generally about Global Britain.
Actually, on Global Britain, first thing I said, the first time I ever did Question Time, just as we were walking out onto the stage, a producer tapped me on the shoulder and said, "It's always a really good idea to mention the name of the questioner in your answer." So I nodded, and about 5 seconds later, as we literally started walking, he grabs me from behind and said, "But for Christ's sake, don't get the name wrong, or you're going to look like a prat on television." But happily, I know Margaret. So Margaret, thank you for your question. It's the first time I've dared to use a name for a questioner. I suppose a couple of things to say about Global Britain. Firstly, it's a fantastic slogan. Say what you like about these governments, they have come up with fantastic slogans. Levelling Up's a great slogan. And Global Britain was a great slogan for a time when people thought Brexit meant we were turning in on ourselves. I mean, it was meant to send a signal. And the answer as to whether or not we know more about it, I suppose, is yes or no. Yeah, no, in the sense that no strategy survives first contact with the real world. And my God, has the integrated review had contact with the first world in the shape of Ukraine. But yes, in the sense that we now know what is meant by the Indo-Pacific tilt. It is things like AUKUS, it is things like being aware of the challenge posed by a rising China, while at the same time, as the integrated review says, our priority is Euro-Atlantic security. So I think that the Ukraine crisis and the UK reaction to it has reassured a lot of our allies that we're not turning our backs on Europe. So I think in that sense it's clearer. I think Brexit has made it more important for the government to be active in foreign policy. There's nothing we've done post-Brexit that we couldn't have done pre-Brexit when it comes to foreign policy. Nothing at all. But there's been more of a political will because the government's had to show that we are still there despite Brexit. And on that question about whether we need closer relationships with EU states, I think, yes, my real fear about what happens with us being outside the European Union, actually, is that we are going to miss out, and we are starting to miss out already, on a lot of key conversations that are now taking place between Washington and other European capitals because of the heft of the European Union. And I think those contacts with Washington are going to be the crucial things that we miss to an extent, rather than anything specific with the Europeans.
So, Anand, so this week, one reason why Nat is stepping in so nobly into this ministerial vacuum is that it's summit week in the world. So we have Commonwealth heads of government about to meet in Rwanda. We follow that up with the G7 in Berlin, and then on to Madrid, where everybody can fry to death the NATO summit, which will probably be very hot. So these are three places where the Prime Minister can go and really push forward and say something distinctive as Global Britain. No need for boring EU coordination or anything like that. It was never very big in any of these fora anyway, but very much striking out. So what do you think the Prime Minister might be aiming to get out of those 3 summits? What should he be aiming to get out of those 3 summits?
Well, I think photo ops and good PR, first and foremost, like all politicians at these meetings. I mean, I'm going to answer that question with an anecdote from yesterday. I was on a panel yesterday at the Resolution Foundation with Maureen Khan, who's an economics journalist at the Times who used to work for the FT in Brussels. And she said something that I found rather terrifying, which was that she'd done an interview with von der Leyen, where von der Leyen had said to her, you know, at these multilateral summits, we'll talk to our friends, but we absolutely won't talk to countries that are on our shit lists in a sort of informal manner. And the UK is on that list. So there'll be no marginal conversations of any note with the United Kingdom. So I think in that particular sense, the rather bad state of our relationship with the European Union is going to get in the way of us doing the kinds of business at those summits that we might.
But Anand, does that just mean that you know, the Prime Minister doesn't get a sort of frosty 25 minutes with Ursula von der Leyen, but does talk to Olaf Scholz, does talk to President Macron, or is that sort of like a unified EU front of shunning Britain?
That is not at all clear to me, to be perfectly honest. But I think at the moment, given the Northern Ireland Protocol bill and how fractious that is, it's going to be hard for him to talk substance, other than Ukraine. I think Ukraine is in a different box to everything else because it's so immediate. It'll be hard to have those substantive conversations with other European leaders at the moment, I think. Sophia,
what would you be advising the Prime Minister if you called you in and said, I'm just brainstorming, you know, advisors, want some outside ideas of what I should be using this mega diplomatic week for? What would you be suggesting he should try to get out of it?
Well, you've got quite distinct aims for each of those different summits. I mean, I agree. I think together as a package, it's a pretty unique opportunity for global Britain. And we have to remember as well, we had the very good fortune and timing last year as well to be hosting both the G7 and COP26 in the kind of first year after the publication of the integrated review. So we've done pretty well out of these sort of platforms, and this combination of 3 things, I think in a way will highlight some of Britain's kind of unique roles, not just in Europe, but globally. At CHOGM, I mean, I think really there's a need to sort of steady the ship. There have been obviously challenges around the leadership, which we will be wanting to resolve there, but also just kind of move on and try and reinvigorate the whole sort of structure and efficacy and strategic relevance of the Commonwealth moving forward. I think certainly in a post-pandemic and COP environment, and with our new international development strategy having just been published, I think there'll be a lot of conversations around that. At the G7, I think it will be difficult to avoid the question about the looming American midterms. This is a key opportunity to get Biden ahead of that, committed to some things, shoring up some foundations for what could be a more turbulent period. Because I don't think in the G7 we've quite had the reckoning yet about how we can have effective decision-making structures when America is not going to be always the driving centrifugal force in pushing things through. And at NATO, I think, you know, it will be an interesting demonstration of the UK. I mean, the UK said we want to be the leading European power in NATO. So we will obviously be wanting to signal that. But what will be interesting about that is it will reveal the complexity of NATO's decision-making structures. There will be many areas in which the UK will align with Europe against America. There will be areas where we align with America against certain countries in Europe. There will be obviously many areas where the French are against everybody else. And obviously this trip to Turkey has been essential in kind of bridging some of that and some of the prep work. So I think we need to be really clear about the nuances in these things. The idea that Britain will be isolated, irrelevant, ineffectual because we have blockages in some of our relationships, I think is really a non-argument. There are plenty of other ways in which we will remain strategically important in those forums, not to mention the bilaterals that will be happening on the side in all of those different settings.
I'm going to come with her. Please put your hand up in the audience if you'd like to come in. We've got a couple of people. Right. OK, we're going to take some questions to Stephen. So we've got a crop of people. So 1 sentence each. And I will cut you off ruthlessly if it's more than 1 sentence. So let's go to all the people here who are all sitting together. This looks like a conspiracy. But anyway, so Yes, so one sentence.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah, I have about 10 commas to put in, if that's all right, to extend the sentence. So, but I'll keep talking for as long as I can possibly keep thinking. And great to see global Britain in its place as what can it bring to the world. And I want to mention Afghanistan, and there are still people on the list who were promised and who worked for the British state in Afghanistan and who were promised to be brought home. And in the middle of Afghanistan hasn't been mentioned today yet, in the midst of a pretty horrific earthquake with many, many casualties. Okay. Right, got that. Thank you.
We'll do Afghanistan, yes.
I'd just like to raise the issue of, ironically perhaps, immigration policy as being a positive result of Brexit in terms of opening up the country to increased immigration from outside of Europe. Now we can restrict the numbers from the EU.
Yep, sounds good. Okay.
Can you comment upon the contribution to global Britain of the trade accord with Liechtenstein and compare that to the trade accord with Australia, which is supposed to add, on the best assumptions, 0.04% to GDP?
Question about trade deals, and then one more question, and then we're going to...
How much more difficult is our global foreign policy made by our dear leader, who the London ambassadors will report home has a very flexible relationship with the truth?
Okay, that's interesting issue that came up in our first session as well. Stephen, we had a couple of questions there about refugee immigration policy. I realise they're not the same. What do you think about, I mean, we're not really talking about Afghanistan, so essentially, earthquake, yesterday the Taliban appealing for help. Very interested to know whether you think we should be offering assistance to the Taliban, obviously, much less support going in as aid programs cut. And, what do you understand really is the problem with the Afghan resettlement scheme, which seems to just be an absolute bureaucratic nightmare?
Yeah, great questions. We owe a debt of honour to those thousands of Afghans who did so much for the UK effort in Afghanistan, both defence, diplomacy and development. And many of them have targets on their backs because of the work they did for us. So this is a deeply moral issue. It's been deeply disappointing to see that many of the Afghans who came under the ARAP scheme, which is managed by the Ministry of Defence, are languishing in hotels, still not being properly processed. We have 12,000 Afghans languishing in hotels here in the UK. The Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme has only just opened. The promise was that it would be for 5,000, up to 20,000 people, probably around 5,000 a year. The statement that came out last week has magically cut that number to 2,000 for the first year. It's difficult for me to see how they're going to get to the 20,000 target. So it's duplicitous. It is deeply immoral, in my view, not to do absolutely everything we can to support those brave Afghans that did so much for us. And I wish that the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme had actually been opened when it was supposed to have been opened.
Stephen, do you think it's, as an ex-civil servant, I don't like to use this word, but do you think it's sort of incompetence, or do you attribute some of these things to violence? Because obviously the government is trying to run Afghan resettlement scheme. Nat mentioned the Hong Kong visa scheme, which has gone quite well. We've got the Ukrainian visa scheme. And meanwhile, anyone just wanting to bring their fiancé in is finding a bit of wedding lottery, because it's very difficult to get a normal visa for anyone else out of the Home Office at the moment. And I know from Labour Party conferences that the cost of all of these is a big issue for a lot of Labour members, but it's the cost that allow us to have the capacity that we have. So would Labour just basically make us all visa processing officials to unblock this, or what is your solution to this? It seems to be bottlenecks.
On the asylum, I mean, I don't know how far you want to go down into the weeds of the asylum issue, but in a nutshell, we have a kind of boring technocratic plan for this, which is A, open up the safe and legal routes, the Syria routes being closed down, Afghan route way too long to get sorted, deal with, there's also an issue around the highly centralised way that safe and legal routes operate through the UNHCR. We think there's a much better way of running that. Sit down with the French and the European Union and get a returns agreement in place. We have to put some skin in the game. That would be a negotiation so that we have a deal with the French and the rest of the EU, which makes it clear that if anyone comes on on a small boat, they get sent back straight away. But I absolutely recognise that the French and the EU are not going to accept that unless we have some skin in the game. So we have to sit down and negotiate with that. But of course, none of that's going to happen when there's a kind of endless war of words between the UK government and the European Union. So we're back to square one, which is fundamentally, because we don't have a relationship with the European Union, it is blocking right across the board. And that is really where I take issue with what Sophia was saying. I think the point with Churchill's majestic circles is they're interconnected. And if you lose trust and engagement in one of those circles, you will lose it right across the board. And that goes to what Anand said about what von der Leyen was saying, is influence and trust and reputation are very, very difficult things to build. They take decades to build. They can be destroyed overnight. And I think that's what's happening at the moment.
So, Anand, this question, we're in a segment on global Britain here. Do you think that the, acceptance of the government's new immigration policy shows that actually the people of Britain are more comfortable with a genuinely global Britain with a very different composition of the nation in terms of the shifts we've seen in non-EU migration and perhaps the sort of losing salience of migration, inward migration, as a political issue?
I think something very remarkable has happened to public opinion over immigration since 2016. And obviously, it seems to me that ending free movement is a key part of why that has happened. I'm not sure I'm entirely relaxed about the public remaining quite so calm about immigration, given the levels of non-European immigration we're seeing at the moment. I hope it does. But certainly there has been a sea change, and certainly there are real opportunities in the new immigration system. It's worth saying that there are also costs to ending the old immigration system, as many a farmer will testify to. So, there are downsides to this as well, but there are definitely opportunities to be had from the new immigration system.
Sophia, I want to come on to the other part of the question about Afghanistan, about sort of help. What should people who cut their aid programmes and support to Afghanistan do in the light of the Afghan earthquake? Should people be rallying around and giving money to the Taliban to help with humanitarian relief in the light of the Afghan earthquake? Or you're allowed to have no view on that, by the way?
When you say, do you mean people as in the British people or the state?
As in governments.
The state.
As in governments. Should we say, actually, we make a humanitarian exception there? Quite difficult to Afghanistan since the Taliban took over.
It is really challenging, and there's no easy way around it. I think this is where our excellent development and aid sector can be leaned on to take the lead, because they will always prioritize need and can be slightly less attuned to the diplomatic imperatives and complications. I think it's very difficult for governments to say that we will go ahead. The Taliban themselves is seizing this opportunity to actually reinforce its sort of claim to be the legitimate governing body in Afghanistan, which of course it is not formally recognized as. So I think we need to be very aware of that. Look, we have to be aware that that whole process involves levers on both sides. We are trying to extract concessions on human rights, which are absolutely fundamentally essential for the people there, particularly the women of Afghanistan, to whom we owe a huge responsibility, having been involved in facilitating their freedoms and then having overseen them being taken away. So I think we need to be very aware of that. I think the only way to get around that in the short term is for us to be sort of channeling money through these very effective development organisations, many of which are based in the UK or have strong links with our government or receive a lot of government funding. In the longer term, there is going to have to be some kind of solution, but I think it will be an ongoing process of negotiation. Can I just come back just quickly on Stephen's point? I absolutely agree that we are in a suboptimal situation in our relationships with Europe. I mean, I think it's extremely unfortunate, unhelpful. It is an obstacle to all kinds of cooperation that frankly, both sides absolutely need to be moving forward with. I just contest the idea that we are not effective at all in those forums. I think that there are still ways in which we are still effective, not least of all because the EU itself is often divided, as we will see in the NATO summit in some ways.
Nat, I want to bring you in on trade deals. We were talking a bit there about UK, Australia. Obviously, this is one of the Brexit prizes, is the ability... Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein, Australia. Liechtenstein you probably know more about than Australia because you've got Europe in your job title. So where's the government going on trade deals?
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to, there was another comment that some of the other panellists have made on contact with the EU and European governments as well. I just wanted to pick up on, if I may, and just to say that from what I can see, from everything that I can see, there has been no drop in the frequency and level of contacts between senior officials and ministers and the Prime Minister with their European counterparts. Been a very high level in recent weeks.
That can't be true because you used to go to working groups all the time. People were always on the sort of Eurostar, going over there. Ministers were sitting in councils on a... Yeah, they might have not wanted to go that much, but by and large, they did.
They were in the room.
Up.
I mean, you make a very good point about institutionalised meetings there, Jill, but it is true that the frequency of bilateral contact, telephone calls between our ministers and their European counterparts, EU counterparts, between the Prime Minister and Mrs von der Leyen, between the Prime Minister and Mr Macron, Mr Schulz, Mr Draghi and so on, remains at a very high level. There is so much to talk about. Food security, how to get grain out of Ukraine, sustaining Ukraine's ability to resist Russia's invasion. There's an enormous amount on the agenda, and those will be points that the Prime Minister, that the Foreign Secretary and other ministers will be picking up on in the summits in the margins of the summits that are taking place this week, just as they always do. So I'm afraid I must very politely say that I don't recognise that, and I think that is perhaps not quite entirely accurate. Coming back to the Northern Ireland Protocol, though, it is important. Of course, we do not agree with the European Union on what next to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol. There are areas where we agree. We both agree it needs to be revised to make work better. We both agree that some kind of mechanism needs to be put in place to triage goods as they go into the province from the island of Great Britain. I think where we'd probably disagree with the European Union is that if we disagree on one issue, in this case Northern Ireland, that we can't talk about anything else. I mean, and we probably take the view, I think, that decisions need to be taken on their individual merits. So, for example, if you take the United Kingdom's participation in EU programmes like Horizon, we would say we should probably think about what is best for the advancement of human knowledge and science rather than our disagreement over Northern Ireland. But that is a matter for the European Union, and we will continue to argue that we should look at these issues separately rather than linking everything together. But there hasn't been a diminution in contact. On the trade deals front, the Prime Minister is off to Japan, where he'll be talking to his Japanese counterparts on exactly that issue. We have round 4 of the UK-India FTA negotiations taking place, negotiations with the Canadians this week too. The gentleman's point about Liechtenstein, an honourable participant in the European family, of course, is very well taken. That it is quite small, but it is important that we complete our arrangements, and including even the smallest European countries. So trade talks go on, and this is a long haul. We've already concluded a great deal. We aim to conclude a great many more. One of the advantages about being outside of the European Union is that the process is a little bit quicker because we don't need to move at the pace of the slowest EU country. Another one, of course, is that those agreements can be concluded in the interests of the British economy alone rather than taking into account a much larger single market. So there's a balance of things to take into consideration, but that, broadly speaking, is progressing quite well.
So I want to come on to another question. This is provoked by Mark English, who's in the audience. It's about Brexit. David Frost this morning said Brexit's working. Mark, conversely, has asked, is it sustainable for UK firms to be at a long-run competitive disadvantage versus European firms? Anand, is the TCA here to stay?
Is it sustainable long term? Probably not. But what makes firms competitive is going to be a mixture both of trading arrangements and regulatory arrangements. And the missing bit, for instance, from that Resolution Foundation study yesterday was what impact regulation might have. And you can see a case where in emergent sectors, the UK government regulates more quickly and more effectively than the European Union. And you see, I mean, one of the striking things about the Resolution Foundation report yesterday was the fact that the UK is still top of the league in terms of foreign direct investment for European countries. That Europe is still attracting enormous amounts of foreign direct investment, which implies that there is something still about this country that will attract that money in. So I think, obviously, the easier you make trade, the easier it is for companies based in this country. But I don't think you should see it simply in terms of the terms of trade, to be honest.
Stephen, would Labour renegotiate the trade and cooperation agreements? Up for review? You might hope to be the government by the time it's up for review. How different would it look?
Well, we're forecast to have the lowest growth in the G20 next year, and we have the highest inflation. And there are a range of reasons for that, of course, and there are global drivers. But compared to similar competing economies, that is where we are. Lowest growth apart from Russia. Sorry, I should have said. So there's one clear reason that differentiates us from the rest, which is that we have put up barriers to trading with 500 million consumers on our doorstep. And the trade agreement that really matters is the TCA. We can do deals with Japan and Australia. It's going to make a minuscule difference. We do more trade with Ireland than we do with China and India combined. So, let's actually get real. Let's have a reality check about this, which is the only way to really, there's many ways that we need to drive growth and productivity up. But one of them is absolutely clearly to remove friction with your biggest trading partner. It's been a fundamental part of British economic policy for decades that we trade openly in order to drive up productivity and as a vehicle for growth. So everything that's happened in terms of the form of Brexit that this government chose has militated against that and has been disastrous for our economy, disastrous for growth, disastrous for exports. So the answer to the question is we need to sit down and have a grown-up discussion with the European Union about sanitary and phytosanitary checks, about better alignment on rules of origin, about a veterinary agreement, about professional mobility agreements, so that we can begin to remove some of these frictions. Now, there was a very sort of abstract statement by one of the previous panelists about sovereignty. I knock a lot of doors in my constituency. Not a single person in my constituency has used the word sovereignty, and there was people sort of talking about take back control, but what they want is a good job that pays a wage that they can raise their family on. And fundamentally, I think the big choice we have to make is, are we going to continue to obsess about abstract concepts, or are we actually going to do something about the economic crisis that we find ourselves in? That's what a Labour government would do, is sit down, have that grown-up discussion and try to improve the TCA so that it actually delivers growth and jobs and productivity.
So Labour wouldn't support Theresa May's Chequers package, which sort of offered alignment, a common rule book on goods, which arguably would have eased some of the problems of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and had a backstop of a UK customs area. You decided not to support that. Meanwhile, the EU also made it clear that they didn't like that because they regarded it as totally unacceptable cherry picking. There is obviously the offer that the UK could potentially argue for re-entry into the single market and the customs union. So why would it be different with a Labour government that would enable you suddenly to go back and say, hi, actually some bits aren't working for us. We know it's working quite well for you guys. That Frost didn't do a very good job, but can we have these bits that we rather like back? Why on earth would the EU agree to that?
Well, as you know, I did not support Labour's policy for a second referendum. I felt right from the outset that we had to accept, I regret the Brexit decision. But I felt we had to accept it, and I argued in favour of what became known as Common Market 2.0, effectively membership of the single market, I think, which would have reflected the very close result of 52-48 plus a whole...
Is that what you're pressing to be in the manifesto?
I'm not, because I'm a realist, and I think that I think we have to go step by step. The relationship is so bad, the destructive behaviour of the government has been so pernicious that we have to start from where we are, which is a very low base. So let's be realistic and let's look at those issues, do the hard yards in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary checks, alignment on rules of origin, and the other measures that I mentioned, and let's get that moving as trust-building measures, confidence-building measures. In any negotiation, you've got to start, if you're starting from a low base, get the confidence going, get the trust going, and who knows where we could go from there. But the reality is, we're not, we have to walk before we can run.
Well, Nat, I'm not going to ask you to comment on the sort of substance of the question, because I think we know what the government would say. But I'm just quite interested. TCA up for review. Even Lord Frost has said, that there were areas perhaps where the UK was too ideological on mobility, things like that. Is the UK government doing any thinking? I don't have to tell us what it is about the TCA review. Is there a little unit somewhere beavering away, thinking, actually, where might we be worried? Where might we want to see improvements? Part of it's Europe strategy, perhaps.
We know that the TCA is, of course, coming up for review, but of course the priority is the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment. And I think I would also probably, a lot of the discussion has been about the quality of the relationship between the UK and the EU. I think one of the things that I would observe from all of the engagement that I've done on the Northern Ireland Protocol with my European friends and counterparts over the last few years, and I've done a lot of it, is I think that they're a lot less, and regrettably, they're a lot less interested in it than we are. We would like our friends across the European Union to take more of an interest in the problems of Northern Ireland, because what I've found over the years is that when we can actually sit down and explain carefully and factually and dispassionately the nature of the difficulties that the province faces, both in terms of getting the unionist community to support the protocol politically, and in terms of the difficulties that businesses face, then they are very interested. There is more work to do there, I think, in getting those arguments across. But having observed the slight evolution of the Commission's position, we are moving in the right direction. Haven't gotten far enough, but we're not necessarily a million miles away. So there will be a question in due course as to look at the TCA, where it's working well and so on. You mentioned the question of what else could go in it. That will be a matter for the government of the day, of course, and it's a highly political question. I don't want to stray too far into suggesting what things might be on the table and what might not. I think I might just permit myself to say that, yes, Jill, we are indeed thinking about that, but I'm not going to speculate as to what things could be dialed up, for example, or what things we might want to scale back in that relationship. There were many things in the negotiation where we would have liked to go a little bit further, but the EU was a bit reluctant, such as the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which frankly we think would be in everyone's interest. But there we are.
The very same Mark who I fingered for that question.
Hi, I'd just like to come back on something that Anand said about trade and regulation. I know that both are important, but I think to use a phrase that's been used a few times today, the jury is out on how far UK regulation will diverge from EU regulation. And if it does, what good that will do to the UK. Mm-hmm. Most existing EU regulation is based on a wide consensus and on common sense, and the UK voted for it. So why would the UK want to change it now? And if it did, what would be the benefits? And how can that, my kind of follow-up question, how can that compensate for making it more difficult for any company in Birmingham to deal with a company in Bratislava or in Berlin than it is for those companies to deal with each other in terms of delays, red tape, extra costs, etc.? It just doesn't seem to me possible.
I'm going to push that back to Anand. Do you want to take that one on?
I think it's going to be more, as I said, in emergent sectors than in existing sectors. So it's not a question of diverging from rules. It's a question of, in new sectors, doing things first and doing things well.
But that's not what Jacob Rees-Mogg is inviting everybody to comment on his famous website. And David Frost was waxing lyrical about the need for a strong sunset, which is all the existing
stock. Surprise you now, Jill, by saying I don't necessarily agree with everything Jacob Rees-Mogg says.
OK, breaking news, everybody. Go file your copy now.
This discussion is separate from the discussion about retained EU law. This is a discussion about things like driverless cars, about gene editing technologies and things like that. And there, ultimately, the hope is that we can attract inward investment and regulate well enough to persuade the EU to follow the sorts of regulatory path we lead in. I mean, I'm not for a moment saying that this is definitely going to happen. But all I was saying in answer to you, Mark, is it's partly a question of how well you do things at home and partly a question of your trading arrangements abroad. And I'm not for a moment denying the importance of the latter. I'm just saying that you've got to look at the two together to get an overall picture. And for the moment, at least, I think particularly in a lot of manufacturing sectors like the car sector, people are just waiting to see what happens and not making decisions about relocating or anything like that.
Stephen, if the government finds, if Jacob Rees-Mogg gets an entry into his mailbox, which comes up with a regulation that genuinely would benefit UK firms really quite a lot, doesn't have any downsides in terms of regulatory outcomes, but would potentially be seen by the EU as unlevelling the playing field, what would Labour do? Assuming you get some sort of vote, because it'll probably be done by secondary legislation, which you can't do much about anyway. But assuming you got a vote, where would you be? Would you be saying, no, nothing, because we want to basically stay aligned and make it easy to do all these deals we're going to do if we get back in? Or would you say, we'll take the competitive advantage now?
I think politics is always about priorities and pragmatism, right? And in my view, it is anyway. It should be. It should be about what is actually going to deliver the most possible benefit for the British people, and particularly to that point about jobs and putting bread on the table. That's the key consideration in my view, rather than arcane and abstract discussions about sovereignty. So the answer to your question is you have to look at the impact through that prism of what will deliver the greatest possible benefit. And if you're going to essentially bite off your nose to spite your face, cut off your nose to spite your face, sorry, by doing something which might deliver some short-term benefit, but in the long term is going to make it more difficult for British small and medium-sized enterprises who don't have reams and reams of people to fill in all the forms and the mountain of red tape that they're currently suffocating under, then you've got to do what's right for those businesses. You've got to do what is right for the long-term smoothness of the relationship, removing as much bureaucracy and red tape as you can. That has to be the priority.
But you're
and divergence is a political choice in this case. I mean, if we talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol, I mean, 80% of the Northern Ireland Protocol issues could be dealt with by an agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary checks. So that's the pragmatic solution that we should be aiming towards. It's clearly a political choice by this government that they don't want to go down that road. And so it's politics versus pragmatism.
And will Labour's view of trade deals depend on whether they make it harder to do an SPS deal with?
Again, I think it's about the numbers. I mean, the reality is, as I said, we do far more trade with Ireland than we do with China and India combined. So you can have as many deals with China and India as you like. You fundamentally have to prioritise. It's the law of gravity, isn't it? The one thing that all economists seem to agree on is that trade is defined by the law of gravity, and that means proximity. Geography is destiny. Whether you like it or not, our trading relationships with our neighbours, 500 million consumers on our doorstep, are always going to be deeper, richer, and more productive and profitable than they are with countries thousands of miles away. It's the basic law of gravity, and not even this government can defy the laws of gravity.
Economists always aspire to be real scientists. But anyway, Sophia, I wanted to come to you with this question. Nat has put a very reasonable position around about the Northern Ireland Protocol because he's a very good diplomat. But quite a lot of other people think that, particularly the way in which the government justified the Northern Ireland Protocol bill last week, its calling on this law of necessity, grave and imminent danger, etc., really was riding pretty roughshod round rule of law and the UK's reputation as an upholder. We hear in other fora about the UK as an upholder of the rules-based international system. That's part of what Global Britain is about. Do you think that that's something we should be worried about, or actually does everybody else think actually the EU, this Northern Ireland Protocol, it's a sort of little local difference between the UK and the EU, and they're both equally bad?
I think the fact that the UK-EU relationship was sort of excised from the rest of our foreign policy and the kind of development of the Global Britain agenda, and it was sort of physically living in another part of government for a while was hugely problematic, and I'm really relieved that it has been repatriated back into the Foreign Office, and I think that that is going to improve our foreign policy on many different dimensions in the round. But it is impossible for us to not draw comparisons and highlight interdependencies between our behaviours in different areas. And I think what is very much a developing trend at the moment, and this is partly just due to the internationalization of media, is that the visibility of domestic actions in a kind of governance framework are becoming very much linked to kind of a foreign policy political theatre. And that's something where, that we perhaps didn't have as much visibility in years gone past, and now we do. We can watch what's going on in America. There can be somebody, in Australia watching the fact that, we're putting this particular bill through and taking decisions around that. So I think we have to recognise that the way in which foreign policy is being made now is in an environment that is much more exposed to, contingent on, and codependent with our domestic social and political situation, but also that there is an international audience that is much more attuned to the decisions we're making domestically, and that those are taken into account in our actions as a global actor. But I always come in somewhere in the middle in these sorts of things, which is, I do not subscribe to the idea that Britain has somehow fundamentally, in every single way, damaged our reputational credibility in the same way that, temporarily reducing our international development budget from 0.7 to 0.5% of GNI, that still has left us one of the leading global donors in development funds internationally. And I think, this hyper-polarization in our politics where we sort of either, with the absolutism and the ideology is not going to help us anywhere. So I do think that we need to be attuned to our international reputation. I do think it really matters. It is particularly for a country like Britain, where we are specifically skilled and given an opportunity and legitimacy to lead through our capacity as a convener, as a diplomat, as a broker. Those things really matter for us. But I do not think that we have sort of irrevocably damaged that in every way. There's no call for complacency. We need to be really careful about it. But I do still think that we are, by many, many partners around the world, considered to be very responsible partners.
I mean, I think, to be honest, the justification of the bill in terms of international law was pretty risible. I don't think the necessity argument carries any water at all. Now, I mean, Sophia's right. Will that completely undermine our ability to do international politics? No. Will it be used against us when it suits the interest of other states to use it against us? Absolutely. Might it damage our relationship with the United States, which strikes me as the big question? Yes, quite possibly. And I think for that reason alone, we need to be careful when thinking about this in terms of our international relations.
OK, I'm going to move on to another question that's based on something that Simon MacDonald said in the geopolitics session. He was talking about the costs of intervention in Ukraine. I think it was a bit of a question, would the West still continue to foot the bill? He clearly thought we should. Sophia mentioned the aid cut, the cut from 0.5 to 0.7. Clearly, Rishi Sunak said that the 0.7 would be restored, though maybe the economy will save him from having to do that by not performing quite as forecast by the OBR at the time of the budget in the autumn. But we also have pressures on defence budgets. Stephen, Labour presumably has lots of ambitions to spend on lots of domestic things that people would like to see, as backlogs right, left and centre in a lot of critical public services, but they're clearly sort of, quite big pressures as well for much more spending on defence, security, potentially restoring the aid budget, and just the cost actually of keeping the Ukrainian war going for whatever. Do you think the government and the opposition should be a bit more honest with the British public that they are fundamentally going to have to foot quite a big bill for a much less secure global environment? That means they're going to have to just cut their aspirations on what they can have in terms of pay or in terms of public services?
I think we make the case that the distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy is becoming increasingly difficult to see. What we've learned, for example, from COVID is how exposed we were and how lacking in resilience we were, how our supply chain so complex and distant, so much of our national infrastructure owned by the Chinese government, for example, 33% of Hinkley Point, 10% of Heathrow Airport. We've had decades of policy which has, well, certainly over the last 12 years, I think, turbocharged this of selling off the family silver. And I think that there's an appetite out there in the British people, amongst the British public, I hope there is anyway, to recognise that the lessons from COVID and from what's happened in Ukraine is that we've got to get our own house in order, and we've got to be prepared to invest in manufacturing and building more resilient critical national infrastructure, and not being massively exposed to risk through having often hostile foreign governments. Fortunately, we're not as reliant on Russian oil and gas as other countries. And I think this has been a learning point right across the board. We've been profoundly naive and complacent in the way that we've dealt with governments such as the Chinese and the Russian governments. And that has to stop. That complacency has to stop. Now, that is not going to come for free. We have to make the case that if we want resilience, if we want a strong national security and defence, if we want to stop millions of Russian money washing through London, and also we want to defend our democracy, we have to be ready to pay for that. We also have to understand the massive strategic value of our development programme. DFID is the gold standard of development across the world, and that's why I just think it's tragic that we haven't recognised the role that it plays in our soft power, in building our international influence, and in dealing with one of the things that came up earlier about immigration and asylum seeking. I mean, so many of we need to be working to stop the push factor. So it makes no strategic sense whatsoever to have this sort of false economy of cutting. I mean, so Labour is committed to getting the army back up to the level of 10,000 soldiers have been cut over the last 12 years from our army. We've committed to that. We're committed to having a development aid back up to 0.7. That's what global Britain means. That's what a Labour government would deliver. I very much hope that we can win the argument, but we've got to make that argument in bold terms and say, look, let's learn the lessons from the last decade or so of this complacent approach, and let's move forward together, actually united. I think there's a really powerful narrative that we can put to the British people on that basis.
So you've already won the argument with Rachel Reeves. So is the argument with the British people that they're going to have to pay higher taxes for all of this, or that they are going to have to see longer hospital waiting lists, or less catch-up in schools, or whatever?
Well, it's about growing the economy. So it's actually about creating jobs that are going to pay more tax into the exchequer to pay for our public services. That means having an active industrial policy so that let's take the steel industry, for example, employs 4,000 men and women in my constituency, is also vital for our own supply chains, vital to our defence industry, vital to our sovereign capability, and vital, of course, to the transition to net zero. We've also said that we would invest £28 billion a year in a green investment pledge, which will be about insulating people's homes and in getting far more offshore and onshore wind so that we have a green industrial revolution. None of that's going to happen overnight, but I think if you've got a plan for the country, a mission, you can get people to say, OK, we see the future in terms of growth. We know that that's going to generate more taxation through growth. And that's the way to pay, and that's the way to get out of a recession. The way to get out of a recession is not through false economies and cutting and more austerity. We've seen that does not work. And in the current turbulent and dangerous world in which we live, it has real national security implications as well as economic security.
Okay, Anand, is that where the public is? We were told that one reason why Mr. Sunak was quite keen on the aid cut was it focus grouped well. That may not be the best way of running your foreign policy or indeed your economic policy, but is there a public appetite for spending more on all of these things that Stephen's just outlined, as well as on core public services?
No, I don't think there is, and there certainly isn't at a time of a cost of living crisis. I mean, Stephen's absolutely right in saying that there is a massive and close link between what happens in your country and what happens outside it. I don't think the public are there. As Rathin said in the earlier panel, you know, if we're going to pull out of Afghanistan and leave them to their own devices, we better increase the number of flights to Rwanda because the two are causally linked. And I think actually part of this is about having the conversation honestly, that what we can do at home and the problems we face at home are linked to what happens in the world. An insecure and unstable Ukraine is bad for us here. An insecure and unstable Afghanistan, as it happens, is bad for us here. But part of it too is about having an honest conversation about what we can do individually and what we have to do together. And the scale of the problems you were listing, Jill, and there are an awful lot of them, means we have to find ways of working collaboratively and constructively and in a proper burden-sharing way with our allies. And having that sort of collaborative network, not just with the European Union, but with other partners as well, is absolutely fundamental. So a bit more honesty in the debates and a bit more creativity in how we tackle things together, I would say.
Nat.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a word or two about international development. So the former Department for International Development has been folded into a new department, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, but we preserve the expertise that our international development experts, valued colleagues have brought with them, and we haven't seen an exodus of personnel. The government has also set out a plan with two simple tests to restore international development spending back to 0.7% of GDP. It set those out last year, and they are, first of all, that debt to GDP should be falling, and secondly, that the budget is balanced on current expenditure. So those are the two rules. When those conditions are met, international development expenditure will move back up to 0.7%. But as Sophia has said, the UK remains one of the world's leading international development assistance donors. And just a final word, because I think it's very important, Mrs. Truss would certainly, and the whole government will want us to emphasise this point. Helping the Ukrainians win the war is going to be extremely expensive. It will be expensive in terms of the development assistance and support that we have to supply. It will be expensive for the British people in terms of having to pay more for their energy and the resultant cost of living crisis that comes with it, and the supply shock and so on. It is going to be expensive. Nonetheless, the government, together with our allies around the world, are committed to doing this because it is the right thing to do and because the cost of a Russian victory in Ukraine is far too high. And that was apparent to me when I went to work in the Russia-Ukraine Crisis Centre on the second day of the war. That was a decision that ministers took immediately. It's clear, it's obvious. Come what may, whatever it costs, the United Kingdom will have to pay to put its hand into its pocket to help the Ukrainians. And one of the reasons that we're confident that our Ukrainian friends will eventually get to victory is because they have so many allies around, powerful, rich allies around the United Kingdom who will do all that they can short of actually going to war with Russia to help them. The United Kingdom, the United States, the European Union, Japan, and so on and so on and so on. And the UK has been and will remain at the forefront of holding that coalition together, which is going to be difficult as the cost of the war continues to bite over the course of this year. But we will do that, and we will stay the course with our European friends because it is the right thing to do.
I mean, Nat, there was an incredibly critical NAO report, National Audit Office report, about the way in which the aid cut was implemented. The fact that you went from 0.7 to 0.5 so quickly meant that you basically just had to cut wherever you could, shredded some bilateral programs, had to pay loads in contract breaking terms and things like that. Does that not cause concern back in SUDO that actually just going 0.5 and then turning it back to 0.7 is actually an incredibly inefficient and bad value for money way of running the aid programme?
I mean, clearly there are some transition costs that are involved when you move from one policy position to another, but we will, at the point at which those two rules are met to increase spending back to 0.7, there will be adequate time to plan how you spend the money in a way that delivers value for money for British taxpayers and improves the conditions of people living in the poorest countries around the world.
We'll have to hope there. I think Lady in Pink wanted to say something.
Just picking up on something that Anand said, I think about immigration. It's been a hot topic during the referendum. It's moved to the back burner. Wondering if you could see any circumstances where this might turn into a hot topic again, resentment rising perhaps with the economy doing not well, unemployment rising, and also a question, if I may, to you at the Foreign Office. Taking back control was obviously, and taking back control of the borders was a very important topic. Now, you've opened the door wide to people from Hong Kong, and I really sympathise with the people, but what is the criteria there? Everybody can come in, 3.6 million people is my understanding.
OK, Nat, do you want to say anything quickly about the Hong Kong policy? I mean, I think Anand mentioned that he thinks that the non-salience of immigration might not continue forever, and those sorts of circumstances could be what leads it to kind of natural.
I think what both the Prime Minister and Mrs Truss would say on the point of immigration is not that the British people were opposed to immigration per se, but they wanted to have a degree of control and a say as to how that is managed, and therefore for their government to be able to make decisions. And if you cast your mind back to the days of Mr Cameron, that was quite problematic actually when it became difficult to look again at free movement of persons. And so within that mind, with that in mind, the British government has chosen to provide a pathway to citizenship for Hong Kongers meeting certain criteria related to when they lived in Hong Kong in the days when it was a British overseas territory. So that's very important. But we see that in other areas, again, with the Ukraine settlement scheme, the Afghan settlement scheme and so on. But that is a political decision for ministers to take, which they are accountable to Parliament, to their constituents and to the British people for. And if the British people disagree with the decisions that ministers have taken, then, of course, they can express that discontent through the ballot box.
OK, Sophia.
I'm writing a paper at the moment about several areas of public opinion that are very dynamic in light of the cost of living crisis at the moment. They are immigration, border control, and also the refugee pathway schemes, net zero transition, and international development spending. My very recent focus groups suggest that these areas where we've actually had kind of majority support are starting to come under a bit of pressure. We should expect that they would, because the circumstances that we're in at the moment in terms of generalized insecurity is not dissimilar to the austerity post-financial crash kind of mindset and environment. And we know that one of the consequences of that is you start to have competition around access to scarce resources. And there's very much a perception at the moment that the government's state resources are under a lot of pressure and state capacity is very constrained. So I think we need to be very attuned to these areas. And we've already seen the government responding to that in some ways around the choices around net zero. So definitely not something we can be expecting will remain very static. I would expect a lot of dynamism over the coming months.
Watch this space. I'm going to ask one last question. I'm going to exempt Nat from this question because I think it's Come in.
You can put your pen down now.
This is a question. We've got the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill coming up for second reading, as Catherine said earlier, on Monday. So just completely unconnectedly, what role do we think former Prime Ministers should play in public life? She said. I can't think why I made that connection. Stephen, you've got some ex-Prime Ministers lurking around. I think the Tony Blair, I should be running Britain instead conferences next week. What role should former Prime Ministers play in public life?
Well, I'm married to a former Prime Minister, so I don't know whether that qualifies me or disqualifies me from... being married to a former Prime Minister, I would clearly say you should do whatever a former Prime Minister tells you to do. But from the more serious and political point of view, look, I think people like Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, John Major as well. I think, John Major has made a really useful and constructive contribution to the political discourse in our country since he left Number 10. And I think that it's good. We need people who've actually been there, who've been in the room, who can speak with experience and can actually point out that so often there are unintended consequences, sometimes intended consequences that can be deeply damaging. So I would support it. I don't think that former Prime Ministers should meddle too much in party politics. I don't think they should get too involved in giving current leaders of a party instructions about what they should or shouldn't be doing. But I do think that they're a very good source of briefing and information about statecraft.
Sophia, you're Australian. I haven't said that before, but a lot of former Australian Prime Ministers rock up over here and give us a lot of advice. What do you think former Prime Ministers should do?
I'm also British. I mean, look, Britain is sort of where it's both a sort of refuge and reinvention pasture for Australian politicians. So you get the good and the bad over here, and always worth just checking in how some politicians are actually perceived by the Australian people. Not always they're not always given the stamp of approval. The ones that come over here and have the loudest voices. But look, I think it's really good for people who've been in really senior positions to still be able to contribute intellectually. And I think that it actually has been a rather unfortunate development of recent years in British politics, this idea of a sort of real cleaning out when you have leadership changes and people resigning, and when not just losing PMs, but we're losing chancellors from Parliament, and there is a sort of counterfactual of sort of imagine if we were going through Brexit if we still had more of these people actually there in the House. So I think in general it's something that we actually do very well in Britain, is accommodating the intellectual contributions of former leaders. But yes, I would also say that it's very important that we look to the future.
Anand, Boris Johnson may be wishing on Monday that Theresa May had sort of taken the peerage or decided to go and pursue other interests, but she didn't. What role should former Prime Ministers, should they put up and shut up, or should they?
No, I think the key is that they should intervene little enough that when they do, you take notice. Which I think differentiates them from many former officials on Twitter who simply go on too much. I think, if you really feel moved to speak on something, it makes a lot of difference if you're not often doing it.
OK. Speaking as a former official, I'm therefore going to shut up and thank my very excellent panel for that question time. Thank you for your participation. Thank those of you who gave me questions during the break. But thanks very much to Nat, particularly. Very well done. Stephen, Sophia and Anand, and David Lammy should be imminent. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you.